In five, four, three, two, one. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Moon Tea Podcast. Today we have Hans Kim.
Hey, thanks for having us over. Woo! Insert applause music. Yeah, glad to finally be on the show. I think you talked about the Moon Tea podcast for a bit and invited me, but we just couldn't get it to work. But we finally got the time and Jonathan was in town. So we were finally able to meet up and do it.
Let's go. Yeah, so Hans and I have been friends since we were children. Literally, 5 years old?
Probably less. We grew up pretty much at our church together.
We went to the same elementary school
for a little bit.
Yeah, I left in the middle of first grade.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah, and we Hans has been working out at Eugene's, which is how I saw him again, and we reconnected again. But yeah, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Should I introduce a little bit of who I am? And
yeah,
okay. Hi, I'm Han. Yeah, one of Jonathan's childhood friends, but I'm also an occupational therapist, and I feel like that in itself needs to be explained because every time I have to say it, people have this assumption. It's like, oh, are you helping people get jobs? Because you're an occupational therapist. And no, unfortunately, that is not what I do. But what I do is help people get back into what occupies your time. So a lot of that can be what we call activities of daily living, ADLs. And so things such as like putting your shirt on, going to the bathroom, just these everyday activities that we might not really consider is wildly important for us. It's so important to take care of ourselves. And all of these things, brushing our teeth, they occupy a good portion of our time, sleep, things like that. So just helping our patients get back into their routines and into their lifestyles, and also just making it more pertinent, more meaningful for them. Whatever is meaningful for them, whatever takes up their time, that's what we want to know. And that's what we want to help them to return back to if they've had some kind of medical condition or if something's just happened to them. That's just the purpose of what OT does, is just to help them return to what is meaningful for them.
Wow, yeah, I love that.
Thank you. But yeah, that's pretty much what I do. Other descriptors, I go to church. I enjoy doing that. I saw Jonathan this past Sunday and it was good to see him. Great to have his presence there. But yeah, just now I'm just excited to see where we jump off from this.
All right. Where are we going? Let's see.
I feel like Hugh should ask questions because Hugh has just met Hans for the first time.
Okay, I get freebies on questions. Okay.
Let him
rip. What got you into occupational therapy? Let's go right away.
So initially I wanted to be a teacher growing up because I just thought it was like really cool to be like, oh, I'm helping a human being learn how to critically think or just approach life, learn. My gosh, I know I have knowledge now. And then I actually did it and I realized just how tiring it can be. And so just mad respects to all the teachers out there. And also just like, I'm getting paid this much to teach 35 kids versus one teacher. Like that just is a recipe for disaster for me. So I was at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and did an internship at one of the nearby school districts. And I was an elementary intern, but it was just so hard because even if I was only teaching 4 kids, like you can just see the gross disparity of just education in like kindergarten. It's not even like high school, but just starting out, you can see like some kids just picked up things quicker, other kids lagged behind, and just wondering how do you equalize the playing field already when there's such like these disparities are already growing. And so it was just hard because it's like, if you're a teacher, like, of course you want to talk to and teach all the students, but you can't neglect the whole class for like just a few for them to catch up. So it's already hard to do that. And so it was just hard for myself to be like, how do I do that without like having smaller class sizes or just like maybe individualized tutoring or something like that. So it was just like hard to be a teacher with that kind of mindset. And one of my friends who is also an occupational therapist got into the University of Southern California, USC's OT program. And she was telling me like, oh, I volunteered at a school district and you should try it out. And so I'm like, oh, okay, what else can I do? So I went and I just saw that it was super awesome that I was helping kids gain like lifelong skills. So like a kid who doesn't know how to write, like handwriting, like I was teaching them how to form proper hand grips or like how to write their own name. And for me, that was like awesome because it's like, yes, I'm still teaching them. And this is something that they're going to use for the rest of their life. And so for me, that was like amazing. And then also like I volunteered at a hand therapy clinic and just to help them recover back their like arthritis hands or just thing with people. I think I have a passion and a joy of just talking with people. And that in itself was like, it was cool because it was, you're just mingling, you're just doing like these exercises or like doing like therapy with them. And they're like, oh yeah, at my salon, I'm doing this. And you're like, oh, that's neat. And you just foster this relationship. And so I think that was really interesting and really cool to do. So that kind of got me into the door for OT. And my second sister is actually a physical therapist. And I think it was maybe like this pride issue of I don't want to do what my sister's doing. Like I'm an own independent man that need no sister. And so I was like, I'm gonna stick with OT just because I felt like it was more pertinent to what people want. And so I think that was like a huge motivation for me is wow, let me help people on what they want to get better at and or want to do. And so that's like the appealing attraction for me with occupational therapy.
Wow, I love it. And wait, so is there a specific age demographic you work with directly on average, or?
Yeah, so there's a lot of fields in occupational therapy. There's school districts where the purpose of OT is to help them access the school curriculum. And so it's a lot of like accommodations. If it's too hard for the student to see the board, sit them closer, or like if it's hard for them to write their name, like even using a computer, that could be something. Or if they're weak generally with like their strength, like doing one-on-one sessions to help them participate maybe in PE, things like that. And then there's what I'm working at is at the hospital. And it's just, and even with that, there's an acute side and there's like an acute rehab side. And the acute side is like patients straight out. Maybe they had a fall, they had surgery, they're fresh out. And I'm like, okay, hey, it's the first day. Let's get up. And I want to see how strong you are and what are some goals we can create to help you go back home. Or if you need more therapy, like what are some recommendations? What are some equipment that I can order for you to help you regain some functional living? And then the acute rehab is more of this intensive 3 hours a day, not all at once, but okay, you like really, if you're living alone or if like you really need more therapy, like this is where we would recommend. And it's more centered on like longer therapy sessions to help them get stronger, get better, basically. And I initially started in the acute rehab side as a student. And then basically just wanting to diversify my skills, I wanted to learn more of the acute. And so eventually I became what we call a float, where you're floating from one unit to another. And then basically I somehow transitioned to just being a full-time acute therapist. And so a majority of my day is I would go into my unit, my cardiac telemetry unit, a lot of hearts, a lot of heart attacks. Yeah. And just them get better and to give my recommendations. Sometimes you might get patients who are like, I'm fine. And they're like 99 years old. And you're like, goodness gracious. And sometimes you have like 58-year-olds who are like, oh my gosh, you have every known illness in the world. And how are you alive right now? And it's challenging and it's interesting because it's like you really don't know what you're going to get. But yeah, I think there's that field. And then there's also different kinds of like pediatric outpatients, like you going to these clinics, helping kids maybe with feeding, or maybe if they like are weaker, yeah, going to like an indoor gym, something like that. And then there's even psychiatric kind of like community mental health kind of OT populations as well. So there's really a large diversity with occupational therapy, which is really nice. But it's also, I think all in the end, they all summarize to what can we do to help our patients return and do something that they want to do. So like with myself, it's you want to go home. All right, here's the steps that I need to see for you to go home. If you're falling all over the place, I'm not going to send you home. That's not responsible. And it's not safe and you're probably going to come back the next day and have to see you again. But yeah, I think it's just, yeah, what do the patients want? And I feel like I'm rambling too much at this point. So I'm going to give it back to you.
No,
This is the
that's
Ramble
amazing.
podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is now my podcast.
That's the yeah, actually though. You're on it, you're the guest, and the time's yours, man. This is actually so cool. I didn't know much about occupational therapy, to be honest, and like really it's making a lot of sense.
I'm curious, what kind of people tend to thrive in OT?
Yeah,
You could talk about that.
sure. I think it's a lot of mindset. If you have a very motivated patient and who really understand, like, oh, like therapy is so important, I think those people do so much better in my population because it's that like self-efficacy and that drive to be like, I want to go home, I want to become better, I want to be independent. And then you have some patients who are like, you know what, I'm old, I'm gonna keel over, like I just give up. And they're like, I don't want to get out of bed today. And it's this is your third day in a row that you have not gotten out of bed and you have severely got weaker. And so like I think people who just, I guess, the therapist to do everything for them, and or maybe are just like they've already given up and feel like, it's I fell and now like my leg doesn't work anymore, so it's over and I'm probably going to die in this hospital, then it's, oh, you're already putting yourself in the hole, both figuratively and physically, as dark as that is.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to do a topic change because I want to get to this other podcast. So can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I have a little side project. I have a podcast called Sharing is Caring, and Jonathan was graciously on it earlier today, sharing his experiences. And so shout outs to Jonathan. And and so if you guys are interested, I guess your listeners can also have a way to listen to my podcast.
Oh.
Or vice versa, a collaboration of some sorts.
Check it in the show notes below.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started with it? Like, why did you like feel like a podcast was necessary? What were you
I mean, as all things, like it's definitely, so I had just broken up with somebody and I was just in this deep kind of contemplation of who am I? And the image that comes into my head is like a Zoolander, right? He's looking in the puddle and he goes, who are you? And that was like kind of me in that period. And then just like, what do I want in life? And I'm still going through this process of like what I really want and just growing as an individual. But I realized that one of the things I do like to do is trying to be intentional with people. And a lot of times I try to give myself excuses of, oh, I'm too awkward, or my voice sucks and I don't know what to say, or I feel like I don't have anything insightful to share. But I felt like God was really convicting me and being like, hey, look, at your church specifically, I feel that it's hard for people to get to know each other, especially like on a Sunday. A lot of people just come in, just do their thing, and then just leave. And it's like, maybe years down the line, you're like, oh, shoot, there was a guy named Jonathan that came over. who was that guy? And had this heart that like, I feel like people are maybe falling through the cracks. And for me, I also help out with a lot of physical labor and just setting up just audio equipment. So for myself, I have a hard time getting to know people because I have to pack everything away before we get kicked out of our quote unquote church or community center. So it was more for myself, like I want to get to know people. And I felt like a podcast would be a great way to kind of go beyond just like small talk of, hey, how was your Monday? Okay, that's pretty cool. It was like a more intentional way to get to know people. And so I decided to just go for it. Decided to buy all this crazy equipment just because I felt like it was worth the investment. I feel like I'm not aiming to be like the next, what's that guy's name? Joe, the wrestler, MMA guy.
Rogan.
Yeah, exactly. And nothing crazy like that. But if it's in some way like helps people who listen, whether it's your listeners, any listeners, just people coming across this podcast, for them to learn and to grow and to be healed, I think that's the point. That's the mission. And yeah, that was a bit of the reason why I decided to make a podcast.
If anyone is wondering why my voice sounds so silky smooth, it's because we're borrowing Hans's setup.
Shout outs to Rode mics. We're not sponsored by them. And NordVPN. I'm just joking, not NordVPN. But one day, hopefully, we'll
Definitely Squarespace.
Squarespace.
Oh my God.
Yes. And Shadow Raid Legends. I'm just joking. Yes.
But I will say, similar for us, a podcast is like, it's such a cool excuse to be like you meet someone random, you're like, hey, you're really cool. Do you want to talk to us for an hour? And
yeah. And
yeah.
I think what's so cool is that like initially people are so hesitant to do it. Like I have so many people who are like, oh, my voice sounds weird, or like something, they try to say something. And after they do it, they're like, wow, that was actually really cool. And thank you for doing that. And I'm like, yeah, it was pretty cool. Or I even have that feeling sometimes where it's just like, oh man, it's hard to bust all this out. I have to go edit it later. But when you do it and when you get to actually have that conversation, you're like, oh wow, yeah, I'm glad I did do this because I got to know this person so much better.
What are you going to do when you run out of people to interview at your church?
I have different ideas. Like sometimes I might be thinking of maybe it's so important to talk about topics. Maybe that's not commonly talked about in the church. And I maybe using that as a way to people, listeners who might have been hurt in the past. Yeah, just talk about some things about that. Other things is like it's okay to repeat guests. And because I've learned that it's just so hard to get to know people within a 45 an hour kind of span. And so like my mission with my podcast is that, yeah, like people are always constantly growing. People are always constantly just evolving. And I think like maybe 2 years down the line, we listen back to this podcast and I'm like, wow, look how different we were as people. And so I think that's the great thing is that we can do that. We can just be like, all right, like we have Hans again. It's been 3 years. Like, what has changed? How have you grown?
Ooh. All right, you ask a question.
What's been some I'm curious on the topics that you've been talking about with regards to your podcast. What is one of your favorite types of conversations you've had and or topics that were discussed?
I think it's more of the conversations of like how people are. I think it's so fascinating that we are so uniquely, because like on Sundays, you have maybe even a one-dimensional idea of how people are. And you're just like, oh, at face value, you're like, oh, this is how this person is. But after doing this podcast, you just see so much of a deeper nuance and so much of a deeper person. And you're like, wow, I did not know this person was like so sensitive or so emotional. And you can only really see that when you have this kind of conversation. And so shout outs to people who are able to be more vulnerable and share what they've been going through. But also just, I think it just fosters that kind of genuinity or like authenticness of, oh yeah, like this is what I went through. And I became this person through that. And yeah, I think it was just some topics I talk about is I do 3 big questions. And basically it's, yeah, how do you involve a church basically is the first one. Second one is who are you and what makes you tick? We were talking about Myers-Briggs, right? Okay, like we can't categorize people as like 16 personality types, but I think it's still interesting to be like, oh, like you are this ENFP. So somewhat like, are you somewhat this kind of personality, like extroverted, needs to have flexibility with his planning and things like that. And then also just the last one is what is God saying to you? So making it specific and personable, right? What is something that you're growing or yeah, what is the next life stage for you? Basically, how are you growing is the last question. And so I just think those are all just like solid questions just to ask people.
I love that we're discussing a podcast on a podcast.
Podception over here.
And then next week we're going to discuss this episode of the podcast.
How meta is that?
So Hans, what makes you tick?
What is my personality or what irritates me?
The second question that you mentioned, I just wanted to throw it.
Oh yeah, I'm still learning, right? It's not like, all right, this is set in stone. But as I was saying, I think I do have this heart of caring for people. I think that's what's even attracted me to the therapist gig. But yeah, I think it's just still like you hear things about yourself that sometimes it's just so hard for you to believe for yourself. Like I can say, Q, Jonathan, you guys are the greatest podcasts ever, like greatest podcast hosts ever. And sometimes you're just like, I don't believe that to be true. You could say that as many times as you want, but I don't know. And so there's some truths that like I hear people say about myself that I'm like internalizing, but I'm like, I don't know if that's true. So it's like this process of, is it really true? Is this really who I am? Or is it just what people are defining me as? But in a narrow sense, I'll share my Myers-Briggs of I'm an ISFP. And I have this Enneagram type 9 personality of avoiding conflict and things like that. But still the deeper sense of I want to care for people. I want to be passionate about what I do and be good at what I do. But yeah, I just also feel that there's still parts that are being developed and still are being formed. It's, how is it going to shape? What's going to happen? It's exciting. Yeah. So that's all I can say for now.
That's amazing. I love that. And then I feel like this is going to be a subtle, if not a very non-subtle way to get a feeling for your podcast for anyone listening, for sharing is caring. So for the first question you usually ask guests, I'm guessing you're pretty public about your own position of like, why do you go to church?
Oh, for me, why do I share why I go to church? Actually, I don't, just because I've been interviewing so far has just been going to my church. So it actually hasn't come up, but I plan to do some kind of segment of, yeah, how I came to the church. Because I think like I just want to allot so much time for them, have that space be for them. So I could share like for every person I talk to, hey, this is how I came to the church. But that would be grossly over like the 45 minutes. And it would just be like, okay, Hans, you're repeating yourself. But I do plan of sharing like how I came to church and kind of the journey that I went through as well. But I really want like the people who I'm interviewing, like this is their time. This is their ability to share. And so I really don't do why I came personally.
I love that. Yeah, that makes sense. I think just on the spiritual side of things, as a group of people who are spiritual in that sense, like what is it about faith that you love?
Yeah, I think for one thing, there's this sense of community when people agree on the same faith principles, it draws people closer together. And so, and when done right, obviously, there's obviously unhealthy ways this can happen where people can feel excluded if you're quote unquote not religious enough, if you're not quote unquote good enough. So that's not what I'm aiming for. But I think when done right, when people are accepted for who they are and it's this authentic come as you are, it's okay who you are, and there's no judgment, right? Like in the end, we're all sinners and we all need God in this kind of idea. And having that commonality and that, oh yeah, like we're brothers and sisters because of that is really nice to fall back onto, because it's, yeah, like originally I wouldn't have any affiliation with you unless it was through my faith. And that in itself is really good. I think also the idea that faith does give me this idea of identity and worth, because a lot of times we might try to default on career or just like external factors to give us worth. But when you already find out like, oh, this God like cares about me so much, like I don't do nothing. And yet like here I am still loved by him. I just feel this great immense joy that comes from that, because it wasn't like I did anything to deserve that, but yet it just, he gives it freely. And so just that kind of truth for me helps me a lot and has gotten me through a lot of tough times, because life is hard. And I think just being able to share the struggles, but also knowing that even in my darkest times, like I have something to turn to and to lean on is incredibly supportive and helpful for me. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was awesome.
Random question, but I'm curious if, let's say like 20-year-old Hans. So Hans is 30 and a half. And then I'm curious if what 20-year-old Hans would think of 30-year-old Hans. Are you where you thought you might have been? Like, yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember where I was at when I was 20 years old. I would still have been in college, but I think he would have been as expected of, oh yeah, like you should at the age of 30, you have a career. Little surprise on the singleness, but it do be like that. But I think for the most part, I think he would be I expected you to be at this level, this kind of social totem pole to say. But I think what might be surprising maybe is just how different we might view life, right? Because before, when I was 20, very driven of I feel like I need to make something of myself and I need to live up to my parents' expectations. I need X, Y, and Z to fulfill my life. And it wasn't until recently where a lot of those things are being undone. And it's, oh, shoot, like, no, these things are just maybe secondary things in my life. And so I think he would probably be like a little shook about, oh, isn't that what drives us? Isn't that what like motivates us to work hard? And it's like, yes and no. Like you got to just know the reasons why you're doing these things, and to know, hey, like even if you do accomplish all these things, like I'm at that point where you're like, you thought we have it made, like we have actual income, disposable income, and you have so much freedom now to do whatever you want, like I would think you would be happier. But I would tell my 20s self, yeah, it's like, it's not what you thought you would want. It's something that you thought you wanted because everyone around you was telling you, like, yeah, this is where life should be, white picket fence, American dream, but it's really not. And so I think it shows just how much wiser I've gotten. But yeah, sorry, I'm just rambling again. Now, I did want to flip the script on you guys. I got a Google form from Jonathan saying what are some topics I was interested in sharing about in this podcast. And I wrote down specifically career and burnout. And so I'm hoping that I could share a little bit about that in this podcast, because as a healthcare professional, I think a lot of healthcare professionals are facing this kind of epidemic in the pandemic. Yeah, if you guys are okay with that.
Nope. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, cancel it. Cancel culture.
Yeah.
Dude, let's go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's go.
I think something coming out of occupational therapy school and grad school is that I had a very, I guess, naive mindset. I said that what was so appealing about occupational therapy is this idea of really helping people get back into what they want and what occupies their time. But I don't think school has really taught me to be like, hey, what if the person just wants to die? And if they want to, or like, what if they're deconditioning and getting weaker so much that they can't go back to what they want to do? Like they need a caregiver, a 24-hour caregiver. And so I think the hospital has just opened my eyes to just how life really is. There's just so many conditions out there that makes my job so much harder, like dementia. Like if you have severe full blown out dementia, like what actual training can I give to you that won't just disappear in the next 20 minutes? And I think just really wrestling with that is so hard, because you come into the profession just so eager to help people, and then just being at a stage where like you question, is anything that I'm doing really helping people? Is anything that I'm doing really meaningful for people? And coming ironically to this part of, is my career meaningful to me? As much as that keyword meaningfulness was for my profession, looking inward and being like, is this meaningful to me? And I was being honest with Jonathan. There's times where I consider a career change. And it's just because it's so hard sometimes to come into work and think, am I making a difference in this person's life? And maybe there's like unrealistic expectations of, I'm coming here, I'm touching people, and then people are getting healed left and right. A part of me actually did believe like I'm hoping that what I do will help people be fully independent again. And realistically, like there are just some days you take a bunch of L's, people go to nursing facilities, they just never get back out and they just get stuck in bed, and questioning just how good of a therapist you are based on the results you get, and really trying to tell yourself that you're not a bad therapist just because a patient you had died. I had a patient that I was working with at the hospital, and it just felt like it was just another session. Took him to the bathroom because he needed to use the bathroom. And basically what happened is what we call a vasovagal response, where someone's heart or blood pressure dropped so much, probably because they were straining, and they ended up passing out. But basically what happened is this guy passed out on the toilet, became unconscious. I called for what we call a rapid response in the hospital. The nurses are flooding in. The rest became a blur. And then I later find out that he died on the way going to the intensive care unit. And really just wondering, like, I came into this profession to really help people, and here I am, I possibly killed this guy by doing therapy with him. And that really got me questioning of, am I really helping people, and am I really making a difference? And I think a lot of healthcare professionals, whether it's nursing, doctors, etc., this pandemic's been hard on a lot of us, because it just feel like COVID is just taken so much. It's like, whether it's like family members or just even humanity, of you're just like, oh, you go in completely gowned up with 3 masks on and like eye shields and things like that, and you just see people like struggling to breathe, and it's so difficult to feel like you're making an impact, and like you almost feel powerless to just Yeah. Oh, what am I gonna do? That's oh yeah, like my lungs are clear now and I get to go home. Right now it's so much better. But when it was really bad in the thick of it, like in like December 2020, my hospital was pretty much like 80 to 90% COVID. And as much as joking around of we should open the gift shop to have more patients to use the space, that was actually almost a reality for our hospital of using the gift shop
Oh gosh.
to house more patients. And so it was just really hard. And so right now the numbers are going up, but it's definitely not as like hard or bad as it was in the past. But yeah, I think there's just been a lot of like reality checks of healthcare isn't just all right, here you go, have some meds and we'll be home in the weekend. It's sometimes you have patients who code and die. Sometimes you have patients who do get better and awesome. That's fantastic. But it could be challenging. It could be hard.
I can't even imagine being on the job and then
Yeah.
someone like I'm sure you've internalized that it's not your fault, but like that would be really hard for me too. If it
Yeah.
was just like, oh, this man was like under my care, and then that was like
What happened?
his last
Yeah.
his
He
last
pooped himself to death.
yeah,
Yeah.
like yeah, that would be really rough for me too.
Yeah. I mean, that's why there's so many kind of strategies and like strategies to prevent like burnout, like compartmentalizing, just setting aside like that was a separate incident. It's not this whole like encompassing idea. Yeah, that's who I am as a therapist. And just it almost sounds like jaded to be like, yeah, like you have to store it away for later and then you'll deal with it later. But you almost have to do that. We're like, yeah, that happened. And it's not, I'm ignoring it, but I'll address it later because I have to still do work. And then self-care. I think self-care is so important to avoid burnout and and as much as people say that, there is a truth of it. Of you need to sleep well, you need to partake in what interests you, your hobbies. And for me, like working out with Jonathan and working out in general has been one of those outlets. But I think it's so important to do that. And for a time, it was hard to do that, especially in the pandemic, because it's like, where do I go? I'm at home and I have to quarantine myself from my parents. I still live with my parents. Yeah, just it was hard to go to work while everyone was remote and then come home and hold myself up again. And it was like, it really felt like just you were just isolated, like by yourself. And that's why like it was so important for mental health and during those COVID times and even during these times too. But yeah, I think it's so important just to set aside and to say these things happen. And it's just something that healthcare professionals just have to deal with. Obviously, like you're not going to see that many deaths at a school district versus like a hospital, but it's definitely happened at the hospital.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, you hear a lot about healthcare workers, and it's just the nature of it. Like we had a doctor on the podcast. He's like a Canadian anesthesiologist, but he was just like, I think if people want to die, like we should let them. And
I almost agree with that. Now that I've actually been in the field, like you see so much suffering, and there's these things called hospice and palliative care. And that's like the easing of if someone's conditionally not doing too well, they'll ease them into hospice. And that's like making sure that they're living comfortably at the end of their life, which I really appreciate because it sucks to just suffer. And that's the thing too, right? There's sometimes I get a little upset because like the son or the daughter wants their parent who's 99 years old to keep living, but they're like clearly like suffering. And it's just, is it just because you want them alive for yourself, or do you want your parent just to go quietly and just let them off like that? And so it's just, do you really want like them to go through another surgery to just to keep them alive a little bit longer? Yeah. So it's just hard to be like, why prolong that kind of suffering?
And that concludes the podcast.
In this podcast.
Yeah, a lot of heavy topics.
Yeah.
And
sorry to be a Debbie Downer.
You good. And yeah, we ask our guests, but do you have parting thoughts? So that could be words of wisdom or a monologue about whatever. Yeah. Do you have any parting thoughts for our, let's say, 14 to 15 listeners?
Listen up, all 14, 15 listeners. Yeah, I think just in the sense of like, what I'm saying already of making sure that you guys are taking care of yourself, like whether it's emotionally, physically, even spiritually. It's just you really have to check yourself before you wreck yourself kind of idea. And so I think it's okay to not be okay at times and to be honest about that. And the need of maybe I need to go see a therapist because it's really hard to just work sometimes. That could be something that you need to do. Or maybe it's just maybe I need to treat myself to some bomb food because I need to treat myself. I took a bunch of L's this week. Like treating yourself and respecting yourself in that kind of way, I think is really important. But yeah, just gauging yourself and just seeing like, how am I doing? And being honest, because maybe we might not be totally truthful and being like, oh, I could keep working like this for another few months and then the burnout really happens and you're like dreading every day at work, or just being like, look, I need to take a sabbatical and it's okay if I miss work and like life will go on. And am I doing what I want to do and enjoying life? And yeah, so that's my 2 cents, I guess.
You heard it here first.
I love it. And then one of the wrapping up ones is, what are some shout outs to any institutions and or your own handles and or podcasts or things you'd like to wrap up? Feel free.
I would shout out to my hospital, but I don't want to
Oh, you're good. No worries.
expose my and they're like, oh, I found you now. But yeah, I think a lot of my hospital coworkers definitely make work more enjoyable. That's for sure. But shout outs to outlets like this, like whether it's my podcast, Sharing is Caring, or even Moon Tea podcast, or just even friends, Jonathan, yourself, Q, or other fellow mutual friends. Community, I'm just going to be general and just say people who care and love for you, family, friends, shout outs to them because it's just so important to surround yourself in that kind of way. I don't think we're meant to be isolated. And yeah, so just shout outs to everybody who cares about us.
Gosh. Hans, you're incredible. You're
Thank
very,
you.
very cool. Thank you so much for opening up. Honestly, like I feel like hopefully we'll have you on again in the future and we could talk more in detail and more in depth about even more career advancement, burnout, work-life balance, positive tools that we could use or listeners could use to improve their ADL, activities of daily living, something I just learned today. That was awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on to the Moon Tea podcast. This is a podcast where we talk about craft, community, building meaningful careers. Tune in next time. Thanks, everybody. Peace.
Thanks for having me.
Peace.